Do pubs even have bells anymore?
Yes.
I'm so old, I go home before closing time. I don't know.
Right.
Anyway, welcome everyone to the latest in our Beer and Brexit series, and we are delighted to have with us Kwasi Kwarteng. I've got some interesting facts as ever. He has been on page 3 of The Sun.
That's true.
But not for the reasons you might suspect, but an even better reason than you might suspect. He's been on page 3 of The Sun because as a University College Challenge contestant in the team that went on to win, he buzzed for a question, the camera panned on him, and he said, "Oh fuck, I've forgotten." Which earned him his place in The Sun. He has a PhD in economic history from the University of Cambridge, so you didn't get into Oxford then.
Absolutely.
His first attempt to get into Parliament was Brent East, that Tory stronghold, but finally elected for Spelthorne in Surrey in 2010, and I think your majority is a healthy, if any majority is healthy, 13,000 plus.
It's a good caveat there.
Yes.
Absolutely.
There's no such thing as a safe seat. He was PPS to Philip Hammond, and in November 2018 became Minister in the Department for Exiting the EU, and you're responsible for the future security partnership.
That's right.
With the European Union. So let's start off with a bit of reminiscing.
You're not going to ask about University Challenge, are you?
I might come back to that, yes,
Okay.
because I find that story quite fascinating, but...
It's quite a simple story. It's not that fascinating.
I'm easily pleased. Were you a Eurosceptic at university?
I was actually more pro-EU at university. And I remember having a big debate with Anatol Kaletsky, who came to Cambridge in the late 90s, and he was very against the euro. Mm-hmm. And I thought at the time that the euro was a natural progression. And so I was arguing for it, and he was arguing against it. And then 20 years later, I saw him at a book festival, and we had completely swapped sides. He was arguing for EU membership, and I thought that actually once the euro currency, we didn't adopt that, then Brexit was not a logical and necessary step, but it was something that was likely to happen. In fact, I think that historians in the future will look back at us not joining the euro as a much bigger step than the actual vote to Brexit. That's my own view, but let's see what happens.
It is amazing how things have changed. When I remember the outcry when arch-Eurosceptic Gideon Rachman was given a column on the Financial Times as if this was the end of civilization.
That's right.
And
the debate changed hugely. So I think that, and why I say the comment about the euro is that I think if we had adopted the euro, Brexit would not have happened. So not adopting the euro was a necessary but not sufficient condition for Brexit. And I think once we didn't adopt the single currency, we avoided that. I think there was always going to be this question of membership that would come back.
And it's worth remembering, I suppose, that if you read the Bloomberg speech again, which I did recently, Cameron's concern was being a euro out. I mean, it was our structural situation vis-à-vis the Eurozone countries that actually sparked his thinking.
So a lot of the debate about Europe at the beginning of this decade, 2010, 11, 12, was about the euro. And in fact, the word Brexit came from Grexit.
Yeah.
And Grexit related to the euro, whether Greece would leave the euro. And then I think Peter Wilding came up with Brexit in 2012. And of course, the name took off.
So, as a historian,
thank you.
Would you like to rank Theresa May amongst Conservative Prime Ministers?
I think I'll avoid that.
Okay, all right, fair enough. I'm going to keep trying with questions like that. I mean,
that's a nice question.
Yeah. When you worked for Philip Hammond, did you talk about Brexit with him?
Yeah, I mean, he had a very different view from me.
Yeah.
And so I was appointed as PPS, as Parliamentary Private Secretary. And in the Conservative Party, a lot of people don't realise this, it's a whip's office appointment. I think in Labour, senior secretaries of state get to choose who their PPS is generally, or shadow ministers. Whereas in the Conservative Party, certainly now, it's very much a whip's appointment. And so I was appointed. I mean, he was indifferent really to me, but he did question me on Brexit, and he said, and he questioned me on other things, and then after about an hour, he said he was happy with the appointment. And actually, we got on very well. We worked very closely on the budget in particular, 2017 budget. Not the U-turn one in the beginning, the end, the last one, the November one. And I enjoyed working with him very much. I had huge respect for his attention to detail, his grasp of the brief. But we did have slightly different views on Brexit.
Do you believe the same thing as him when it comes to the economic forecast about Brexit?
I think, he was one of the people, I mean, he was Foreign Secretary at the time, and he was, I hate to say it, but I think he was quite involved in the whole Project Fear thing, and that didn't really come to fruition. And people say, oh, we haven't left yet. No, the actual comments were made about the vote, And so when George Osborne made his remarks, he said we're going to have a budget. That budget was in the immediate aftermath of the vote. That was his plan. It wasn't a budget at some subsequent date where we would have left. And I think a lot of those predictions, thankfully, will prove to be completely wrong, actually.
But you get, as an economic historian, that there's a difference between a short-term economic forecast that tries to predict behaviour and a long-term economic forecast based on putting in place barriers to trade.
Yes, I do. But the problem is that if you're making, which they did, predictions about what will happen in 2030, there's no earthly power in the world which can describe what happens in 2030. And my father's an economist. I was an economic historian. And I think broadly, when Michael Gove said, we don't believe in experts, I think he didn't phrase it that nicely. But I think there's a broad point about the pretensions of economics. I mean, economics is essentially a social science. It was known as political economy until essentially the middle of the 20th century, broadly. Okay, the late 19th century. And it's adopted very much the prestige, the heavy mathematics of physics. But it can never be physics. It can never be a hard science because you're dealing with human motivation and human behavior. And I think that, I respect economics hugely, but I think some of the claims that economists make about the subject and some of the authority that it tries to bring to itself is pretty spurious. That's all I would say. I think we've got to take it with a pinch of salt.
One of the hardest things about my job is that my gut reaction will be to join in slagging off economists now. That's what I'd like to do personally, but I'm going to actually stand up for them and say, aren't you being slightly disingenuous? Because, all right, I take the point that no one can predict what the British economy will look like in 2030. But that's not what these forecasts are doing. What these forecasts are doing is saying broadly, all things being equal, and all sorts of other things will affect the size of the British economy that we can't predict. If we're outside the single market and the customs union, and we're therefore trading less with our nearest and biggest trading partner...
Look, I'm not here to argue Brexit, okay? I'm making a very broad comment about economics as a discipline and the kinds of claims that it makes for itself. It has very little predictive power. As the Queen is supposed to have said in 2008, why didn't any of the economists see this financial downturn coming? And then some of them said they did, but the vast majority didn't. And in a subject like physics and chemistry and actual hard sciences, physical sciences, they do make predictions which can be falsifiable. And when they are falsified, they change the theory. So to try and make economics the same thing as a hard science, which essentially is what many economists are claiming or trying to push, I think is completely wrong.
Okay, but there is a happy medium between over-claiming and dismissing everything.
Sure, I wouldn't dismiss everything. Okay. You've got to interrogate the assumptions and you've got to understand the assumptions. But that's the bit that I think is the most open to debate, the various assumptions. I mean, people made certain predictions in the 1890s about traffic in London, and they didn't know about cars. I mean, that was a massive, massive innovation, which no one could predict. So I think, yeah, it is helpful, but I think people slavishly follow predictions which are not made. It's a social science at the end of the day. It's not a hard science.
Did you consider throwing your hat in the ring for the leadership?
Oh, every day. Actually, it got to the point, there was one point about 2 months before the thing kicked off, there were about 20 candidates. Yep. And my researcher put them all in the spreadsheet. I won't even say all their names.
You had a spreadsheet?
I had a spreadsheet because I wanted to tally what was going on. And actually, the spreadsheet became very useful because I saw that lots of people had, before, it wasn't public, they'd pledged to about 3 or 4 candidates. And this always happens in Tory leadership campaigns. So you've got to keep a tab of what everyone has been saying. And then I thought, well, I mean, if so-and-so is going to run, why shouldn't I run? But I didn't, thankfully.
When you say so-and-so?
I'm not going to say who the names were. Because some of them did run and some of them didn't. All right. I mean, all sorts. And one person came up to me and said, I said, you don't have a chance. You don't have any money. You haven't raised any money. You don't have a parliamentary operation. And nobody knows who you are. I was very blunt.
Yeah, but apart from that.
And they said, no, I think I've got a great campaign. And then he said, I want you to be in charge of the parliamentary operation. I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to work. Because you've got to, I think if you're going to run for leadership, you've got to really think about, who you are, what you represent, what platform you have. And I think a lot of the candidates perhaps hadn't thought that through so carefully. And actually, many of them didn't run in the end, and I think that showed a lot of judgment. And some started to run and then pulled out, which again showed some degree of self-awareness.
I'm almost embarrassed to ask you this next question, but do you reckon you'll be in the next cabinet? I
have no idea. I don't think so. I don't even know who's going to win.
You're a Tory rising star, aren't you?
Yeah, people say that. You know, that's the kiss of death.
Endorsement from
that's the kiss of death.
Official endorsement from the UK in a changing Europe. What could possibly go wrong?
That's the kiss of death. I mean, the number of future prime ministers that I've seen, and the number of them that actually became prime minister is about 20 to 1, the ratio, roughly. So I would very much avoid that sort of definition. Look, I like my job. I'd love to stay in DEXU. I might get offered another job. I might have to leave the government. We don't even know who's going to be the next prime minister. I know you want to prejudge that, but you know, it could go one or two ways. And I'm a Boris fan, a Boris supporter, but you know, let's see what happens.
Are you a strong enough Boris supporter to make the case that he was a good foreign secretary?
I think he was a good. No, I would say he was a good. He was a good. No, hang on. He was a good. I think he's a very strong representative of British interests. I mean, he was unorthodox in many ways, but I think that, and what I want to quell is this idea that he was somehow a completely hopeless foreign secretary, because there were a lot of enemies he had, not only outside but within the party. Whatever he'd done, he could have had the diplomatic skills. I was going to say of John the Baptist, but you know what I mean. He could have had extremely good diplomatic skills, and it would have been spun that he was a disaster. I mean, he's one of these figures who's always going to attract controversy and attention, and people have strong views one way or the other. And that's a function of being a very strong politician. I mean, there isn't a politician, you talking about history. If you look at every single big politician, however you define that, in the last 300 years, they've always divided opinion. They've always been quite controversial figures. Looking back 300 years later, we don't see that. But at the time, they're very controversial figures. I've just been at a literary festival with a lady called Anna Beer, who's written a fascinating book about Walter Raleigh, Sir Walter Raleigh. And she was saying that at the time, I mean, now he's seen as a kind of a hero of British intrepidity and all of that, and adventure. At the time, he was an incredibly divisive and controversial figure. And I don't think Boris is that divisive, actually, compared to some of these figures in the past. And I hope that he can win.
Well, you've segued nicely into our next question, because you actually wrote in the Sunday Times that you think he's a unifying figure.
I think he can be a unifying figure.
Isn't that a bit curious, given that there are members of your own party who have said they can't stay in the party if he becomes a leader?
So if he becomes the leader, I don't think anyone will leave the party. That you can quote me on that. If he does become the leader, I don't think any of the MPs
absolutely will.
I don't think any of the MPs will leave. What they do in any kind of subsequent vote on no confidence, I don't know, but I don't think they will formally leave at all. And I just feel that, you know, as Mayor of London, he did bring people together. Now, I always say the Olympics, and people say it had nothing to do with it, but we always play that game in politics. If something goes wrong, it's absolutely 100% your fault. If the Olympics had gone wrong, people would have said Boris was a disaster and a shambles. Of course, when they went right, then it had nothing to do with him. And I always think that, you know, we should be even-handed in politics.
That's a bit like our office.
Is it like you found the same? Yeah, and so I think that he captured something about the spirit of London then, in some way, and I think that was unifying.
Now, we're going to have to talk about the Brexit negotiations a little bit, I'm afraid.
That's fine. It's called Beer and Brexit after all, isn't it?
Well, I've got wine, so I can do what I want. But
I was going to say, it's your event. You've christened it Beer and Brexit, but you're drinking red wine. That's very interesting.
I've got a 50-year-old bladder. We'd have to have tea breaks, and then we'd have to have breaks if I started drinking beer. But you didn't want to know that, sorry. Yeah. What does he have that Theresa May doesn't have? I mean, what is characteristic of both these candidates is they seem to think that they have something sort of in and of themselves, let alone their new negotiating teams or their new strategies. That means they can turn up in Brussels and the EU will say, you're not Theresa May, we'll scrap the backstop.
So, dare I say it, I think that's quite an academic view of looking at things.
I take academic as a compliment.
No, it's good. It's good, but it's slightly different from my point of view. The problem Theresa May wasn't the negotiation with the EU. The problem Theresa May had was getting this thing through Parliament. And the big problem she had was that her governing coalition didn't come together. I mean, the EU, they're on record, if you look at the documentaries, they're on record as saying they couldn't believe the fact that a third of the withdrawal agreement was relating to the Northern Ireland backstop. The protocol was on the Northern Ireland Protocol, from about pages 300 to 450, something like that, of the 585-page document. was about the Northern Ireland Protocol. And they couldn't believe that we didn't get the DUP on side. You know, so the failure of, and I was involved in that, I was the bill minister, the failure to get it through Parliament was an extraordinary piece of parliamentary history. And the fact is, the key component of the governing coalition, the DUP, voted against the deal 3 times. And that says to me that something clearly has gone wrong with parliamentary management. So I think that's one thing that a new Prime Minister, whether Jeremy or Boris, can rapidly deal with. Because there's no way that you're going to get a deal through with the configuration of the Parliament when the DUP votes against it 3 times. Now, I use the phrase necessary and not sufficient. Mm-hmm. It may well be that having the DUP on side is not sufficient, but it was absolutely necessary to landing a deal. And I think from the parliamentary point of view, the impasse we reached was because of the Parliament. It wasn't necessarily to do with the negotiation.
Well, 2 things. I mean, firstly, there's a circle to be squared, isn't there? Because if the only way of getting the DUP on side is to suggest changes that the EU isn't willing to accept, nothing moves.
Sure, I get that. I also question this assumption that I get asked all the time, oh, they won't move at all, they're set in stone. They've already moved. Last year, they said alternative arrangements was effectively impossible. Mm-hmm. They ruled that out. Mm-hmm. This year, they've said that they want to look at alternative arrangements. That's 180-degree volte-face. So they can change. They are flexible. And this idea that, that everything they've said is set in stone and they're not going to move, I question that as well.
OK, well, let's just talk for a second then. Mr Johnson, last night, talking to Laura Kunsberg, was talking about all the technology that you can use at a border, the fact that you can do checks away from the border, and that basically you do not need a hard border in Northern Ireland. There are ways around it. If he genuinely believes that, why doesn't he just sign up to the backstop, because it will never be used?
Well, he did vote for the deal with the backstop, but of course the House of Commons rejected it. And I was, funnily enough, just seeing a company today, Fujitsu. They've done a lot of work on alternative arrangements. They feel that there is definitely a solution. And clearly, I think, in terms of the backstop, alternative arrangements is going to be something which is going to play a bigger part. And the question that I'm afraid Theresa May had to answer was how seriously people question. I'm not questioning her sincerely at all, but people have questioned how seriously she took the alternative arrangements deal or issue when she went to Brussels earlier this year.
But at heart, isn't this just a question of trust? Because ultimately what the EU will have been saying today, let's not prejudge what they'll say in the future, is you find a way of making that border work, that's absolutely fine. Sure. If we're happy with it, we'll let it fly. Absent that proof, why should we trust you? Give us the backstop. And let's face it, if they're dealing with a Prime Minister who's threatening to withhold money we've agreed to pay them, which they see as a liability, why should their trust be any greater?
So I think that I take a slightly different view, as you can imagine. I think that they want to get a deal done. They want this Brexit thing to be put to bed. And they are actually very open about trying to reach some sort of conclusion. With regard to the hard border, the Irish government have said they don't want a hard border under any circumstances. Mm-hmm. We have said we don't want a hard border under any circumstances. And the EU themselves have said they do not want a hard border under any circumstances. Now, given that those are the positions of those 3 parties, I don't believe it's beyond the wit of the officials or the wit of man to come up with a solution with alternative arrangements to deal with the problem. Now, with the backstop, you're asking me about the backstop. I voted for the backstop. I voted for Theresa May's deal 3 times. I was the bill minister in charge of trying to bring this thing through. So I was completely interested and involved in trying to get the deal through, but it didn't work, didn't happen.
You said in the past that one of the problems with the negotiators was that the negotiators had become friends or were friends.
When did I say that?
We will find out.
Get back. I agree with that, but I just wanted to know when I said
I can't remember when you said it. I haven't got footnotes. But is that an accusation that Ollie Robbins went native?
No, I wouldn't use those words. But I think when you're in a negotiation, you've got to think about the politics back home, and you've also got to engage with the people you're negotiating with. And I'll say this very broadly about the process. My understanding was that it was a very bureaucratic process. The Prime Minister took a bureaucratic view and essentially, I think, forgot about Parliament. Because that's the only way you can explain why we lost by 230. Can you imagine it? 230 was the majority against the deal when it came to the House in January. And this was a record. I think people had to go back to the 18th century to see a governing party lose that heavily. And even then, when they scoured the records, they didn't find.
Isn't there a different spin you can put on that, though?
What is your spin?
Well, the spin on that would be that actually MPs didn't start to take it seriously or understand what the hell they were doing until the third vote, by which time the majority...
But do you think, as a Prime Minister, that... And people forget this. People forget about how our system evolved. There was a Prime Minister before there were organised parties. And the whole point of being Prime Minister from Walpole was that they could manage the House of Commons. Mm-hmm. That was the key part of the job. And I think that as a government... we failed to do that. And a very clever, friendly American professor made a very good point about what happened with the Theresa May's deal. Those of you who know and have read about the First World War will know that after the First World War, President Wilson came up with this idea called the League of Nations. And what he did was he negotiated the League of Nations with the powers in Europe and then tried to sell it in Congress. And do you know what happened? It completely bombed. Because he thought, right, this is a really sensible idea, this is a great idea, reasonable people like me and across the world think the League of Nations is a fantastic idea, and that the Congress would rubber stamp it. And you know what, they didn't. And I studied First World War history at university and all the rest of it. I didn't see that analogy. And it was very interesting that this American professor made that analogy between Theresa May and her withdrawal agreement and President Wilson and the League of Nations. It was a classic case of negotiating with people abroad, and then sort of somehow slightly forgetting about your constituency at home and the domestic politics that could realise your dreams. And I'm afraid that the analogy is quite a good one.
I mean, I'd love to do it and sort of, for devil's advocate's sake, defend Theresa May's handling of Parliament, but I can't find a way of doing it.
But how do you do it? I mean, she lost by 230. I was there. I mean, I said to the whips, I came into the department in November last year, and at that time, you'll remember, we were going to have the meaningful vote in December.
Yeah.
And I said to the chief whip, or one of the whips, I said, so why don't we have the meaningful vote in December? He said, we can't possibly have the meaningful vote in December. And I said, why not? He said, we'll lose by 200. Let's do it next month. It'll be, we'll have squared the necessary alliances and we'd have got it through. And then I remember seeing another whip the night of the vote. And I said, so what's the score? She just showed me. She couldn't even utter the numbers. And it's 202. And I said, 202, that's a huge defeat. He says, no, 202 is the votes we got. The actual vote was 230 against the margin. This was unprecedented. I mean, we're living through times which nobody has ever seen, and we think it's normal. Now, for a government, and a lot of journalists said at the time, this is absolutely extraordinary. I thought, actually, that she might resign at that point. But we had two further iterations. I think the closest we got to was 58. Mm-hmm. That was on the third vote. And as I've said, the DUP, the keystone of your governing arch, rejected the deal 3 times. This is not good parliamentary management. I hope you're not teaching that to your students, because it isn't.
I avoid my
It
students.
isn't. This is not good. I mean, I think Theresa May had great strengths as a Prime Minister, but parliamentary management, and people will look back in the past, was not something we have been particularly good at.
No, it does seem to me that there is a certain lack of numeracy on all sides in Parliament at the moment when it comes to votes. But do you think ultimately you're going to need Labour votes?
I think we want to get votes wherever we can. I mean, that's the aim of the game. I think that we could have approached Labour slightly earlier in the process, and that was one of the things that people in the party, in the Conservative Party, found very difficult.
Yeah.
Was that having said that she wasn't going to rely on Labour votes, in the end, after 2 years, she reached out to Labour, and they said, well, why didn't you do this 2 years ago? And I never found an answer to that.
Well, I mean, surely the answer is 2 years beforehand she had a majority, and what Prime Minister with a majority in Parliament starts chatting to the opposition?
So I'm not talking about exactly 2 years ago. I'm talking about the
post-election.
June the 9th,
post-election.
2 years ago when we lost the majority. I mean, it didn't take an Einstein to work out that, in a hung parliament, we needed to build a broader parliamentary coalition if we were going to get anything through.
Do you accept the fact that there is a danger inherent in the way some of your colleagues are talking about the civil service?
I think a lot of that has stopped. And I agree with you. I mean, one of the things that I've discovered, and they're all here, so I better watch what I'm saying. Hi.
They're rubbish, aren't they?
I've been really impressed. You know what I'm going to say now. I've been really impressed, actually, by the civil service. I mean, I've only been a minister for 9 months, and as a Conservative backbencher, we have a certain view of what the civil servants are doing. But actually, being in the machine, I've really enjoyed working with them. And people say, no, that's because they know how to butter you up, and that's probably true. But I think that, no, seriously, I think they're a first-class outfit.
But nonetheless, you have colleagues who are going out there, who are involved in the negotiations, who are going out there making it sound as if the negotiations were run by civil servants and not ministers. Now, negotiations aren't run by civil servants, they're run by ministers. They have been all the way through.
Well, that's the theory, but there's a view that perhaps the civil service view was not as interrogated as closely as it might have been. That's one of the views.
So you're saying the civil service didn't follow instructions or deviated from those instructions?
No, I don't think they did. I think they followed instructions, but those instructions happened to be things that they agreed with. I don't think there was much tension between the officialdom and the...
Okay, in which case it's nothing to do with the civil servants or...
No, I agree. I'm a great fan of the civil service.
Okay.
I'm not saying that they did a bad job at all. And actually, when ministers blame civil servants, I'm always reminded of, the adage, bad workmen blame their tools.
Yeah.
I think the civil service needs to be directed. It expects clear instructions. And if it doesn't get that, then, things can be more complicated, more difficult.
Do you think the EU is going to amend the backstop?
I think they might do. I mean, as I said, with alternative, I've been told, they will never change, they're set in stone, they're not going to compromise. I've seen them change quite considerably on alternative arrangements in the last year. If you look at what they were saying just a year ago about alternative arrangements, they completely dismissed it. This year, last few weeks, they've changed their tone on that. So that shows that they are flexible. They're not this sort of granite, inflexible, implacable machine that we have to deal with.
You see, we've already got a bet, and I don't want to bankrupt you. Because that
it's only £10.
Yeah.
So the bet, by the way, is that Anand thinks there'll be a general election before the end of the year, and I don't think there will be. So it's £10 at even money.
So a quid 20
actually, I'm not
MP,
sure it's very good
for
ministers to be saying that they indulge in gambling, but this is just a very friendly, friendly
it's
bet
not a proper bet,
friends. Yeah.
So do you think it's a sensible strategy to threaten to withhold the Brexit bill payments?
I think some of the money's related to so there's a difference of view in terms of how legally binding it is to pay all the money. My own view, and this is a view that Jacob has expressed in the past, is that we should be paying to the end of the budget period. So the budget period begins on the 1st of January 2014 and ends at the end of 2020. So if the deal had gone through, we would have had about 20 months of the budget period. The other monies are, which I think, there's an open discussion in terms of how much we should contribute for civil service, pension liabilities, and that sort of thing. And that number isn't a definite number. It'll be a negotiation anyway.
Okay, I think you've slightly sidestepped the question then. I mean, as a matter of principle, I mean, we might all quibble about what the sum should be, but as a matter of principle, do you think it's a good... Well, it's either right or it's a good negotiating strategy to say, look, we're going to withhold, because the language is very much implied that this is a down payment on a trade deal rather than a payment for liabilities or for continuing membership.
So I speak to, in my former life I was in the city, you didn't mention that, but I speak to bankers all the time. And American bankers...
You from opprobrium.
Yeah, that's right. American banker, very senior man, said he didn't understand the deal. He didn't understand how we had the money and there was a deal and we couldn't actually make that work for us. We couldn't say, well, here's the money, here's the deal we would like, in exchange for the deal, we give you the money. And I said, we don't operate like that. We've got civil servants who operate by the rule of law and we do everything by the book, which we should do. But a lot of people around the world are very surprised that we should be in the position we're in, given the fact that we were net contributors and given the fact that, we could potentially give them a huge amount of money. But that's all I'm saying about the negotiations.
All right, okay. Could you imagine circumstances in which you would vote for a Northern Ireland-only backstop?
A Northern Ireland only...
So the original backstop, before Theresa May won the concession that lost to the vote.
I voted for a backstop 3 times.
But the Northern Ireland only one, not the whole UK
So
one.
the problem with that was the whole DUP issue.
Yeah.
And that was something which would divide the union. So I would have a difficulty with that because the DUP are key part of the coalition.
But imagine a world where we had a Conservative majority government. Think really, really hard. All right.
Yeah, like 3 years ago, 2 years ago.
All right.
I probably wouldn't go down that because I'm enough of a unionist and I have to talk to DUP friends in terms of what they thought about the integrity of the union.
Do you think members of the ERG might?
I don't know.
I'm asking you to speak for your colleagues.
You'll have to ask them. I don't know. I mean, they tend to be very pro-union, and they have very good relations with the DUP, so probably not, but you'd have to ask them.
I mean, Nigel Dodds has said he'd rather stay in the EU than risk the union. Do you share that view?
I don't see them as conflicting principles. I mean, I was told, again, I hate to bring back to 2016, but we were told that, you know, this was catnip to the SNP.
Yeah.
This basically would mean that Scotland would be independent, this was a disaster. And then the next year we had a general election. And because we did badly, people forget, the SNP did the worst of any of the major parties. They lost a third of their seats, which no one predicted.
But there is reputable polling out there that suggests that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, there might actually be a majority in Northern Ireland for unity with the Republic.
So, again, you know, there are lots of polls. I don't happen to think the Brexit issue is what will undermine the union. I think the union, the pressures on the union stem from far wider, broader causes. And when people quote polls at me, I mean, Anand, you've seen the last 3 years. I mean, the polls are all over the place. So when one poll is quoted at me as kind of hard evidence, I tend to be very sceptical.
We've obviously got different temperaments, because I tend to believe the polls that say things I don't like.
Yeah. But I don't believe any of them.
Distrust the polls that say things you don't like.
I don't believe any of them. I mean, I don't believe any of them, actually. So the polls that said we were 25 points ahead. There was one poll, we were on 50%. Before the general election, we were on 50% in the country. And I said, this doesn't... And it helped us. I mean, I'd love to have believed that, but I didn't.
But it might have been right.
I didn't think it was.
It might have been right.
It might have been, but it wasn't right. There are lots and lots of polls that one believes or one doesn't, and we just have to wait and see. Also, you know, these polls are on hypothetical situations. They're on a situation, if such and such happens, what would you do? And those are notoriously iffy polls. Everyone knows, again, we're talking about social science, you know, when you're trying to poll on something that hasn't happened and it's a hypothetical, it's a very shaky basis on which to base sort of numerical data in which to make an argument.
Okay, I want to talk to you briefly about no deal.
Sure.
I mean, firstly, I suppose, is successful no deal an oxymoron?
Look, I think no deal can work. I think, you know, my department's been preparing for it. I don't think there'll be a big economic shock. I said yesterday to the Times, one of the reporters, and he wrote it up and said, wow, this is incredible. And this is just the point that Mervyn King made. If you look at GDP from 1800, I know it's a very, very long time ago, but if you were to look at a graph, you would see that the British economy over 200 years has grown up between about 1.5% and 2% a year on average. And he made the point that if you covered the years, you covered the x-axis, you wouldn't actually be able to spot where the world wars and the big tremors were, because through this even growth. And I said, no deal is not a world war. It just isn't. It just isn't anything like that. And so on that basis, I don't think it will have a long-term effect on the growth of the British economy. And what makes countries rich? You know, Adam Smith talked about it. It's tax policy, macroeconomic policy, innovation, productivity. These are things that, frankly, have nothing to do with Brexit, or very little to do with Brexit,
all right,
in my view.
I mean, two things. Firstly, it isn't a world war.
No.
Isn't a recommendation.
No, I get that. Sorry, I accept that. I was trying to make an argument. The logicians called it a fortiori. I was saying, if in the case of world wars, you can't even see a tremor in this particular instance, which is not anything like a world war. Let me say, it's nothing like it. It won't have any long-term impact on the growth. That's my view. I mean, you know, and that was the view that the old governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, had as well.
But we live in a country where, you know, 2 years ago, KFC ran out of chicken and people rang the police.
Sure, that's true. You didn't, did you?
No, well, I would have done. I was very upset. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I just shouted at KFC.
Look, I don't want to trivialise. I mean, you know, my department has been working to deal with no deal for the best part of a year, more than a year. When the Prime Minister said that, you know, Brexit, when she went to the committee and said, the liaison committee, and said that the Brexit department's main function will be to prepare for no deal, you know what, that's what they did. And Mark Sedwell, actually just the other week, last week, I think, 2 weeks ago, said that some of the no deal preparation he'd seen was the best work that the civil service, in his experience, among the best work that they'd ever done. So there's clearly a real professional focus on making sure that no deal can happen and that we're ready for it.
So why is the candidate you're supporting talking about ramping up no deal preparations then?
Well, there was a time, I think, in April where we'd dialed it down because we'd got the extension for 6 months. In March, we were about to leave the EU. It was quite full on, and I think it was dialed down in April. And what Boris, I believe, is saying is that we should ramp it up because that's something that we need to focus on.
I'm not looking at my watch because I'm bored. I'm looking at my watch because we have to leave at 7:30.
Oh, what a shame.
Is that over? Yeah. All right, let's just talk about the politics of no deal, because this is what fascinates me.
Yeah.
It strikes me as probable, let's say probable, that we can't foresee everything that would happen because of no deal.
No.
So there will be disruptions of some kind, some way, shape and form. It might be queues at ports, it might be certain goods not getting through, it might be certain supply chains falling apart. We have quite a low tolerance for that sort of thing. We've talked about the refinery blockades. We remember Black Wednesday and the impact that had on the reputation of the Conservative Party for economic competence. How does a government take us into no deal? I mean, even if it isn't catastrophic, even if it isn't 10% off GDP and all that stuff, even if it is just delays, shortages, queues.
I don't think that'll happen. I hope it'll be, the disruption will be minimal. That's what we've been planning for. But you're right, there are things that could happen. But I think that's something that's
how do you stop
manageable.
Supply chains getting messed up?
And so the alternative is, having said that, 100 times, I believe, that we were going to leave on the 29th, and then having written for an extension, and then having got the extension on the 31st of October, I think any government that then asks for another extension would be in an even more difficult place than the situation you described with no deal. That's my own view. Now, we have a different view.
But I'm talking about the country, you're talking about the party.
I'm talking about the country, and you were talking about how does any government, which is party-based, you were talking how does any government respond to that politically? Because when you mentioned Black Wednesday, you were talking about the fate of the Conservative Party afterwards. That's what
the reputation of the Conservative Party.
That's what I. But I'm saying we have an equal reputational risk, having said that we were going to leave on the 29th, and then having said that we're going to leave on the 31st of October. To delay again, I think, has also a reputational risk.
Okay, I mean, this morning the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders had their annual summit, and the head of the organisation was absolutely unequivocal. No deal for the car industry would be a catastrophe, okay? Ramping up car prices, threatening jobs.
Sure.
So whatever the risk of delaying the 31st of October, how do you win an election if he's right? Okay,
so how do we win an election if, having said that we were going to have... And I see the world very differently from you. I mean, I'm in a constituency where, as you said, I got a 13,500 majority, and the Brexit Party got 40% of the vote in the European elections, and my party got 11%. So I've got a different perspective on democracy and how people will react to the Conservative Party if, again, for the second time, we delay that date.
Okay.
And you're talking about the economy, and I'm fully cognizant of that. But I'm talking more broadly about our political risk and trust in politics, and I think that's a huge element.
I get that
in this.
But what if they're wrong? I.e., what if Brexit Party supporting voters who assume that no deal will be fine and it's Project Fear and it's crying wolf? What if they're wrong?
So my point wasn't about whether they're wrong or right. My point is about a reputational risk that the entire political class has. We had a referendum. Both parties, main parties, said that they would honour that referendum in their manifestos. And if they don't, I think there's a huge reputational risk about democracy in this country. That's what I think.
Right, let me make it specific. If we could leave on the 14th of November with a deal, or the 31st of October without a deal, which would you choose?
I would prefer to leave on the 31st of October with a deal. So okay. I'm having my cake and eat it, to coin a phrase. But I think we can get amendments to the deal, and I think we can leave on the 31st of October.
Well, another practical question then: how do we pass the withdrawal agreement bill? I mean, I'm starting to wonder whether
You've asked that before.
Yeah, but I'm starting to wonder.
And I said to you that the one thing you had to do, if you were Theresa May, was to get the DUP on side. Now, as I've said, it was necessary, but not
the withdrawal
sufficient.
agreement, the withdrawal agreement bill.
The bill.
How do we pass that in time before the 31st of October now?
I think it could be done. I think it depends when it would be introduced, but I think if you introduced it at the beginning of September, I think you'd be able to get it through the House by the end of October.
And the Lords?
Yeah, I mean this
is serious legislation.
No, but Anand, we've been here before. I mean, the whole basis, the reason why Theresa May resigned was that she said she was going to introduce the withdrawal agreement, one of the reasons, the withdrawal agreement bill, And there was a clause in the bill, it's never been published, but there was a clause in the bill saying that there would be a second referendum, which people rejected. Now, the time frame for the introduction was, I think, the week beginning the June the 4th. And the idea was we were going to spend 6 weeks and get it through. That was the idea.
But the beginning of September doesn't give us 6 weeks. You've got 2 weeks to the Lib Dems. Then you're all breaking until, I think, the middle of October with the SNP.
With the recess. I don't know, but that's for the parliamentary management. But I think it is possible.
Okay, all right. Do you think that Conservative MPs who vote against no deal should have the whip withdrawn?
No, I think they should have the whip withdrawn if they vote in a no confidence deal.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, they voted against no deal in various House of Commons motions. But the idea that if in a vote of no confidence, you can vote against your government and then keep the whip is for the birds, frankly. So that's what I would say.
Did you see the piece by Robert Saunders in the New Statesman about British conservatism?
No,
I mean, he said three things. I mean, this is sort of headline stuff. He said the party has stopped thinking, it's stopped conserving, and it's lost its suspicion of ideology. And I'm going to put you a specific question on each one. I mean, with regard to stop thinking, this seems to be a leadership contest of wild, unfunded and unaffordable tax
So I think
cuts.
there's a lot of thinking. I mean, if you look at people like Neil O'Brien, just to mention a lot of MPs, we've written, Beyond Brexit. I think there's a huge amount of ideas. Whether those ideas are adopted by the leadership is another question, because I think we've gone through a period where we've had a very intensely bureaucratic approach to government, and people are saying that perhaps we could be more sort of fluid in terms of adopting ideas and having more intellectual creativity. But I don't think that's a chronic condition of the party. I think if you look at MPs across the party, there are lots of people with lots of fizzing with ideas and policies. But the difficulty is getting the government to adopt and drive some of those policies.
But you have candidates for the leadership promising extraordinary tax cuts that clearly haven't been costed, and it's not at all clear where the money comes from or what will be sacrificed.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that talk on tax cuts and funding is regrettable. I mean, I wouldn't have pursued that. I mean, if you're alluding to the Boris fiscal drag point,
others, yeah.
I mean, in the actual article, he didn't put any numbers there, and somehow the numbers, I don't know who briefed that it was going to be between 50,000 and 80,000, all that sort of thing. But that wasn't part of the article and what he was talking about.
But something's changed. I mean, your party didn't get its manifesto costed in 2017 either. I mean, this is a strange turn for a Conservative party.
In 1979, I know it's going back a bit, and we're quite old, but the Tory manifesto, I looked at it 2 weeks ago, actually. Do you know how much was costed there in the 79 manifesto?
No clue.
Nothing.
I didn't read the Conservative manifesto.
Nothing. And yet they had lots of ideas. Actually, when the beauty of that manifesto was that it talked a lot about philosophy, it talked a lot about the state and so-called ideology that your friend is saying that we're now entranced to. And it didn't have any costings. But at that time, there was a real ferment of ideas. Nobody would say that Thatcherism didn't have ideas. I mean, you might hate the ideas, you might disagree with them, but they had it. There were ideas. I mean, Tony Benn said of her, to me, actually, and he said it many times, Margaret Thatcher, there are two types of politicians. There are weather vanes and there are signposts. And the weather vanes obviously buff it around with the winds, and the signposts are very clear about the direction they're going. And he said Thatcher was a signpost. Even though I totally disagree, this is Tony Benn speaking, with the direction she was going, she was a signpost. And actually, going back to that time, there was an ideology, broadly, and there were very little costings in that manifesto.
So which of the two is Boris Johnson?
I mean,
is it the Boris Johnson who blew the dog whistle on immigration in the referendum campaign, or the Liberal Internationalists?
I think Boris, broadly, and people forget this, but Boris actually supported Ken Clarke in 2001. The first year that he was in Parliament, he was a Ken Clarke supporter. He's someone who doesn't make any bones about the fact that he's a one-nation Tory. And a lot of people, his friends now on the right of the party, do question some of his very broad, slightly fiscally expansive commitments. So I think he's been a sort of broadly one-nation Tory ever since he's been in politics.
But isn't one of the problems with him that he's been a little bit of everything at some point, which means that we're not exactly sure which one we're going to get?
So it's a very interesting thing. 20 years ago, I remember someone saying, someone like Blair or Clinton, they could reach all parts of the party. And that was a good thing. A politician who can range across, the extremes of his party, appeal to the centre of his party, build a coalition. That's a good thing. Boris did exactly that with the MPs. And now he's being accused of being a flip-flopper or saying things to all things to all men. I think that's a very sophisticated politician. I mean, I would struggle to do that. I think it's a very sophisticated politician that can bring enough people from different wings of the party to back them in the leadership. And that's exactly what he did in the last rounds that we saw 2 weeks ago, in the last 2 weeks.
I don't think Blair ever reached Corbyn, I have to say.
Well, he used to have tea with Corbyn a lot.
Yeah,
I mean, Corbyn still, actually, it was Dennis Skinner he had tea with. You're right. He didn't reach everybody.
So, I mean,
but he did have a broad coalition within the party.
I mean, the second charge of this article by Robert Saunders, and I should say not all academics are my friends, so this isn't necessarily, is the party of conservation now has members who slag off business, slag off the civil service, abuse Supreme Court judges. That's a bit weird, isn't it?
Again, I would go back to the 80s. In the 80s, because he's saying that this is all new. He's saying his thesis is that somehow, at some point in the past, the Conservatives stood for this.
No, the thesis is that core elements of conservatism have been abandoned.
Yeah, and I would say that challenging vested interests, certainly since Thatcher's time, has been a tradition within the Conservative Party.
What are you conservative?
As Nigel Lawson said, he never described himself as a Tory. He said, I'm a Tory radical. His memoirs are memoirs of a Tory radical. So the idea that the Conservatives are just, want to freeze everything in aspect.
That they're conservative.
I think is something that I would challenge. I'd love to have, I don't know who this Robert Saunders is. I'd love to have a conversation with him about it.
And we can put you in touch with him.
Because I don't think his understanding of the history of it is quite right.
And the third claim, I'm going to soldier on here,
sure,
is that the Conservatives are famously a pragmatic party, but Brexit is basically an ideology.
So again, I'd go back to the 80s. They said exactly the same thing then. They said this is not pragmatic, this is not consensus-driven, this is too ideological, and we won 3 general elections. Okay, the opponents were split, but we won 3 general elections with good majorities. So again, that's not something that is new. I don't think it's true, actually. I don't think we're any more ideological as a party than we were 30 or 40 years ago.
You don't think your party looks and feels and sounds fundamentally different to how it sounded 5 or 6 years ago?
I think Brexit has brought things to the fore that were underlying. But are you asking... Bill Cash was saying those things 30 years ago. We had people in our party who haven't
you always find the odd outlier, but now it's front and centre, isn't it?
I don't think it's only front and centre because the European issue has become front and centre through Brexit. But I think there is still a broad range of opinions on all sorts of things.
How many Conservative foreign ministers have said F business?
Well, he said it in a private conversation. I mean, you haven't had dinners with Conservative foreign ministers. I've heard them use a lot fruitier language than that on all sorts of things.
On business? I mean, I'm just thinking
on all sorts of things. I mean, I wouldn't want to go there if I were you. I mean, he said this in some dinner, and he uses the F word probably a bit too liberally. We all do, and he said this in a private dinner. I don't know what the context was. The conversation was leaked, and it suddenly became a huge thing. That's the danger of these things. I'm amazed I've agreed to do this, because everything, and this is open, but everything gets eaten. You can't say anything.
Yeah, but it's fun, isn't it, this?
It is fun. Is good. I'm enjoying it. Good. I'm enjoying the beer as well. I'm not sure about the Brexit beer, but the beer's good.
Who should your party be more worried about, Jeremy Corbyn or Nigel Farage?
So that's a brilliant question. And
well done, Alan.
No. My sense... So again, we were talking about necessary, not sufficient, all of that sort of stuff. I think there's a sequence. So we're going down the road. I mean, I hate using metaphors because Boris uses them all the time, and he always gets into trouble for them. But we're going down a road, and Corbyn is at the end of the road. We can deal with Corbyn at the end of the road. But there's this big boulder in the middle of the road with Farage's name on it. And somehow we've got to get rid of that or move it to one side before we can actually try and defeat Corbyn. So I think that they both pose a threat. But we have to. I don't see how we can successfully deal with Corbyn without putting the Brexit Party and Farageism and all of that back in its box, or in a much less forceful position than it is today. So they're both threats, but we have to deal with one before the other.
We're almost doubling back, but if the price of dealing with Farage is leaving with no deal. I mean, do you accept that there'll be any economic disruption in the event of no deal?
I think what I would say is that whatever it is will be far, far less than a lot of the doom mongers and scaremongers are saying. That's
because if there is any, it affects your ability to take on Corbyn down that road.
Yeah, I think there's risk. There's risk in everything in life. There's risk in any policy. And I think there is risk, but I think those risks have been grossly overstated to the economy as a whole.
Do you think no deal increases the chances of you losing that second?
So you've asked me, I don't know how many questions.
No, I know, but I mean,
about 40% of them have been on no deal.
I'm talking about the politics now.
And I think, well, we have to see what the fallout of, if we do have no deal, what the consequences of it are. But I think that, I actually have a private view, I don't think Corbyn will get in. Now, the Labour Party might change leader, and I suspect that they might, given the fact that we've done it. I think there'll be a lot of pressure among parts of the Labour Party to refresh the Labour Party. But I don't think Corbyn himself will get to number 10.
Who do you personally feel closer to politically and ideologically? Jacob Rees-Mogg or Dominic Grieve?
Depends what issues. I mean, on social issues, I probably am more with Dominic. On the European question, I'm probably more with Jacob. And on the economy, I don't know what Dominic Grieve's views are on the economy, actually. I don't know what his... I mean, I know him, but I don't know him so well to know what his views about economic growth and regeneration and the budget. I don't know what his views on the budget are.
Do you think the parliamentary party is becoming an unsustainably broad church?
Well, again, the party's always been a broad church. You look at the history of the Conservative Party. There've been pro-empire people, there've been anti-empire people, there've been pro-free trade people, there've been protectionists, there've been pro-EU people, dare I say it, there've been anti-EU people. There's always been these cleavages in the Conservative Party and differences of view and debates within the party. And I think that's a healthy thing. It's the same with the Labour Party. There's always been huge divergence of views on all sorts of issues, on nationalisation, on, as I say, free trade, on labour reform. There have been all sorts of divisions in the Labour Party, as well as in the Conservative Party. This isn't anything new. This isn't anything new at all.
Do you think it's good that it is Conservative Party members that will choose the next Prime Minister?
So we were talking about this earlier. I think that it's a massive improvement on where we were before. So people forget this, but I'm old enough as you are to remember the 1990
I'm very young.
Transition. I know you were in primary school then, but some of us who were doing our GCSEs at the time remember.
Oh God, you did GCSEs?
Yeah. That's right.
I did O-levels.
I know. Cool. All right. Remember that at that time it was just the Tory MPs. You know, we were having a new Prime Minister. And I remember when he was elected, no one had heard of him. And people said, who's John Major? You know, Powell actually famously said, I think John Major doesn't exist. I think he's a confection by the media. And that's how we elected our Prime Minister. And again, not even the distant past, we all remember, 2007 and 2016, different parties, we had a new Prime Minister that wasn't even elected. So having 160,000 members have a vote on a new Prime Minister is a significant improvement on the times before, where these people either emerged or were uncontested and came to power.
I mean, I get you're going to need their vote one day when you stand for leader, so you can't say the danger is they elect a leader who's fundamentally out of touch with the electorate at large.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I'm never
nor should you, because you've got your ambitions.
No. Look, I mean, this
some
idea
free advice, don't say it.
This idea...
Move on. I've got other questions, we're fine.
This idea that the members are, you know, what did Cameron's man call them? Swivel-eyed
loons.
I think that was just completely... And that actually sums up what happened to Cameron, really, because he didn't really understand much of what was going on in the Tory party in the country. And if he had done, I think he would have taken a much more cautious view of the referendum and how he campaigned in it. I think he underestimated the strong feelings that many members and Tory voters had about the EU.
Are you looking forward to his memoir?
I'm thrilled about his memoir. Because I remember a friend of mine said, well, Hillary Clinton came out with hers in 6 months. Do you remember? What happened? Mm-hmm. She lost in November 2016. And the memoir was out in 6 months. Whereas I think David has had a more sort of maturing, more leisurely approach, perhaps, to his memoirs. But I think the book will be fantastic. I look forward to reading it.
You're going to do a review of it?
I might do. Depends who wants to do me to do.
Who's asking?
Absolutely. No, I think it'll be fascinating because I think that a lot of these memoirs are very interesting for what they don't say. So it'll be very interesting, you know, who he talks about, who he doesn't talk about, and how he perceives what happened. And I think actually it would have been very interesting to have the memoir immediately afterwards, because like all human beings, we always use hindsight, perhaps to justify or to explain what we've done. And I think 3 years on is quite a long time.
I'm taking that as code that you can just look under K in the index.
No, that's what everyone does.
Arrives in
But I
the
never
post.
see
Yeah,
myself
right,
in the
right.
index, unfortunately. But
Who's your political role model?
I don't really have a political role. I mean, the people I admire in politics. I like Margaret Thatcher. I liked a number of the people around her. I liked Nigel Lawson. I thought he was a very interesting...
Cast the net, sort of internationally. In all of history,
internationally,
you're a historian.
I thought Barack Obama was very interesting. I think Macron is very interesting. I don't necessarily share all their views, but the way they project themselves, the way they connected with their electorate, I think...
But who's the politician that's most inspired you?
I think a combination. I mean, I like, as I say, Thatcher was an extraordinary figure in my formative years. And actually, I met her once and I said, you're the reason why so many people on the Conservative side, and the Labour side, frankly, went into politics. But she was the dominant figure of our time. I just an anecdote on this. I made my maiden speech, and there were 20 other MPs in 2010, including Gavin Williamson and all sorts of people. And there must have been 20 speeches that day, and 10 roughly from Labour, 10 from us. And 3/4 of the speakers mentioned Margaret Thatcher, either for good or ill. And I remember thinking, I was sitting in the chamber thinking, she left power 20 years ago, in 1990. And in 2010, we were still talking about how Thatcher had influenced us or spurred us in one way, positively or negatively, or all of that. It seemed like an extraordinary thing. And it was almost as if the last 20 years, the preceding 20 years hadn't happened. So she was a big figure in my political development. Now, I don't think everything she did was right, and I think her style, she led sometimes a lot to be desired. But broadly, she was a very impressive political figure.
Outside of Brexit, which overshadows everything at the moment, what is your overriding policy priority?
So there are two things. I think the way we do infrastructure in this country needs a radical look at. And now I think, my own view, and I've spoken about this and written about it, is that the problem with infrastructure, we've got the money, we could raise bonds, and we can spend the money, but the projects, the actual projects, how we decide what to spend money on, and the speed with which we act is a big problem. I mean, now, people talk about Crossrail, that still hasn't been delivered yet. That's clearly a problem. The third runway at Heathrow, which is a big constituency interest of mine, has been debated for 15 years, 16 years. The government white paper was in 2003, and they just took it off the website last October, because I always used to go back to it. And then one day it was like, your request has been rejected or something. And I think we've got big issues about how, and I know Osborne set up the National Infrastructure body or whatever, the NIA I think it's called. But I think we've got an issue with that. And the other thing is innovation and skills in terms of not so much school leavers, but the apprenticeship piece and the sort of 16 to 19 further education. I know we brought in T-levels, but I think the way in which the workplace operates, our education system isn't catching up quickly enough with how work is evolving. So those are the two interests. Those are my two big interests in terms of driving growth and productivity. I think we've got to look at training, education, and infrastructure.
Before I let you go, we have a quick fire round.
Yeah, I've read the questions. Though,
have you?
I'm prepared. Yeah.
How?
I'm officials. I've got officials.
Oh, I think we sent you the wrong.
They've done their research. Anyway, just far away.
Gutted now. This is ruined the whole thing.
I'm not going to change. I mean, they're quick fire. I'm not going to.
Beer or Burgundy?
Beer.
Beatles or the Stones?
Beatles.
Good, you have read them. Cheddar or Camembert?
Cheddar. I'm going to say that, aren't I? I mean, given Brexit.
Well, if you've got no taste. I'd like to say for the next question, Jacob Rees-Mogg didn't understand it. Oasis or Blur?
I can just about understand it, and I think
well
Oasis.
You think Oasis?
Yeah, I think Oasis are better.
Beef bourguignon or steak and ale pie?
Beef bourguignon, I'm afraid.
Okay,
that won't go down well in the
No, not at all. UK in a changing Europe or any other think tank you care to mention?
So what do you think I'm going to say?
Well, I don't know. I've got a present here for you. You don't know what it is.
It's
totally up to you whether you get it or not.
Let me think. It's a difficult one. UK, IC,
there we go.
IACA. IACA. Oh, wonderful.
Oh, yeah, you see?
Can I drink my beer out of it?
You can, indeed. Yes, that would be lovely.
This is mad. I don't have much left.
With the cameras going mad. It's really exciting. Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you so very much indeed for coming along this evening.
Enjoy that.